A queen in a business suit was led away in handcuffs. This is the story of Leona Helmsley, a woman who built a legendary hotel empire only to see it crumble into a federal prison sentence. By the end, you will understand the shocking true cost of a life ruled by greed and pride. We will uncover how a Brooklyn girl became a billionaire queen and what dark secrets finally brought her throne crashing down. What does it truly take for a person to believe they are above the law? Her story began far from the gilded lobbies of Manhattan, in a world of hard work and modest dreams. Leona Rosenthal was born in 1920 to immigrant parents in New York City, growing up in a crowded Brooklyn apartment. From a very young age, she possessed a fierce ambition, a burning desire for something more than the life she saw around her. She watched her parents struggle and decided her path would be different. That ambition led her into the workforce early, where she learned a fundamental truth, that in the world of business, you had to be tough to survive. She found her first real foothold in the competitive field of real estate sales, a perfect arena for her relentless drive. Here, she honed a personality that was both charming and utterly uncompromising, learning to close deals and overcome objections with a singular focus. Her first marriage to a lawyer named Leo Panzirer was a step into a more stable, professional world, yet it did little to quell her own towering aspirations. This period forged the core of who Leona would become, a woman sculpted by hustle, sharpened by rejection, and utterly convinced that her own effort was the only currency that truly mattered. The polished queen of the Helmsley hotels was, in these early days, still being formed in the noisy, striving streets of Brooklyn, a reality she would later work very hard to obscure. Her ambition found its ultimate catalyst in a man who was, in many ways, her perfect opposite. While Leona was loud and combative, Harry Helmsley was quiet and reserved. He was not just a wealthy man, he was a real estate titan, a legend who quietly owned entire blocks of Manhattan. By the 1970s, his name was on skyscrapers and commercial empires, yet he preferred to work from the shadows, a brilliant strategist who shunned the spotlight. Leona met him professionally while she was a top-performing real estate broker. Their connection was instant and electric, but not in a purely romantic sense. It was a meeting of complementary forces. Harry saw in Leona something he lacked, a fierce, unapologetic public persona who could be the face of his empire. She saw in him the ultimate platform, a kingdom already built, awaiting a queen to rule it. He provided the vast, solid foundation of property and wealth. She brought the dazzling, demanding spectacle of luxury. This partnership quickly became both professional and personal. Leona left her second husband. Harry divorced his wife of 33 years, and they married in 1972. With that union, Leona Rosenthal, the striver from Brooklyn, did not just marry a rich man. She merged her identity with an institution. She became Leona Helmsley, and she was now ready to build a legend not just of brick and mortar, but of perception and power. The stage was set for a new kind of hotel and a new kind of hotelier. The partnership between Harry's empire and Leona's ambition transformed the very idea of a luxury hotel. Their strategy was audacious. They did not just buy properties. They bought landmarks and then reinvented them with a single, uncompromising vision: her vision. The crown jewel of this growing empire was the Helmsley Palace Hotel on Madison Avenue. This was not a new building, but a historic masterpiece, a stunning Gothic-style structure that had once been the Villard houses, a set of magnificent mansions from New York's Gilded Age. To Harry, it was a prime piece of real estate. To Leona, it was a palace waiting for its queen, and she intended to be that monarch in every sense of the word. She personally spearheaded a staggering $8 million renovation, a sum that would be astronomical today. Her involvement was not that of a distant executive approving budgets. It was an obsessive, daily immersion. She would arrive on site, inspecting every inch, her voice echoing through the marble halls as she demanded perfection. No detail was too small to escape her scrutiny. She personally selected the thread count of the bed linens, tested the weight of the silverware, and approved every crystal chandelier. The message was clear: luxury was not an option, it was a mandate, and only her standards would suffice. Upon its grand opening, she did not merely manage the hotel, she embodied it. She became the hotel's living symbol, appearing in now famous advertisements where she presided over the lavish lobby, dressed in opulent gowns, with the tagline that would define her public persona: "It's the only palace in the world where the queen stands guard." She was not just the owner, she was the star attraction, the demanding sovereign of her own glittering domain. This was the peak of the Helmsley legend, a perfect fusion of historic grandeur and modern, ruthless ambition, all revolving around the unwavering belief that she, Leona Helmsley, was the indispensable heart of it all. This carefully crafted image of the queen was not an accident. It was a masterstroke of marketing genius. Leona understood something fundamental about the allure of luxury. It wasn't just about fine sheets or marble floors. It was about the story, the fantasy of exclusivity. She became the living, breathing star of that story. In a series of now iconic television commercials and print advertisements, she didn't just endorse the hotels, she embodied them. There she was, draped in furs and diamonds, gliding through the gilded lobbies, her expression a mix of regal pride and stern vigilance. The most famous tagline, "It's the only palace in the world where the queen stands guard," did more than sell rooms, it sold an entire mythology. It told the public that at a Helmsley hotel, you weren't just a guest. You were an honored subject in her court, and she was personally ensuring your every comfort. This persona was meticulously designed. She presented herself as a perfectionist so demanding, so utterly obsessed with quality, that nothing less than absolute excellence could ever reach her guests. The newspapers and magazines ate it up, running stories about her firing employees for a single stray thread or a smudge on a mirror. Was this all just a clever act? In many ways, it was a brilliant amplification of her true personality. She took her own relentless, often brutal, standards and turned them into a public brand. The message was clear: if the queen herself was this unforgiving, then the experience she offered must be beyond compare. For years, this strategy worked flawlessly. The Helmsley name became shorthand for a certain kind of old world. No expense spared opulence. People booked stays hoping for a glimpse of the legend, willing to pay a premium to be part of her story. But here lies the trap she built for herself. In cultivating this image of a monarch, she began to believe it completely, not just as a marketing tool, but as a fundamental truth about her place in the world. The persona stopped being a costume she wore for the cameras and became the skin she lived in. And what happens when a queen, convinced of her own divine right to rule, is told that the laws of the land apply to her, too? That disconnect would become the crack in her empire's foundation, a crack that started with something seemingly mundane, the bills. Behind the glittering hotel lobbies lay a private world of staggering opulence. The Helmsleys did not merely live in luxury. They constructed a personal universe of it, a modern Gilded Age where money was not just spent, but wielded as a tool to build monuments to themselves. Their primary residence was Dunelin Hall, a 28-room Georgian mansion set on 26 acres in Greenwich, Connecticut. This was not just a home, it was a statement. The estate featured manicured formal gardens, a swimming pool, tennis courts, and stables, a sprawling compound fit for royalty. Inside, every surface whispered of expense, from the hand-carved woodwork to the antique furnishings. But Dunelin Hall was merely the crown jewel in a collection of properties that spanned from a penthouse atop their very own Helmsley Palace Hotel in Manhattan to a sprawling estate in Arizona. Their wealth was not static. It was constantly on display, a rolling exhibition of acquisition. Leona's legendary jewelry collection included a 46-carat diamond ring, so large and heavy she reportedly found it uncomfortable to wear for long, yet she wore it anyway. Their garage housed a fleet of matching Rolls-Royce automobiles, each one a gleaming symbol of their synchronized success. Art adorned their walls, not as personal passion, but as trophies of financial conquest. Yet perhaps the single anecdote that best captures the scale of their extravagance involves a dance floor. For a party at Dunelin Hall, they were unsatisfied with the existing ballroom. The solution was not to decorate or renovate, but to commission an entirely new $1 million marble dance floor to be installed just for the evening's event. After the guests departed, the magnificent floor remained, a permanent testament to a single night's whim. This was life at the very peak, a realm where every desire was in order, and every order was executed without a second thought for cost. The public watched this spectacle with a mix of awe and growing unease. While the advertisements sold the fantasy of the queen guarding her palace, the reality showed a queen who lived in several palaces, each more lavish than the last. This visible, almost aggressive consumption began to breed a quiet resentment, a sense that the line between admirable success and grotesque excess had not just been crossed, but paved over with Italian marble. It set the stage for a critical question, one that would soon be asked in a courtroom. If they spent so freely on themselves, what rules did they follow when it came to the government? But the polished queen of the television ads had a shadow, a persona so starkly different it earned her a nickname that would stick for life, the Queen of Mean. Behind the palace walls, away from the admiring gaze of the public, Leona Helmsley ruled not with a scepter, but with a whip. The stories that leaked out were not of gracious hospitality, but of a tyrant who treated her employees not as subjects, but as disposable serfs. Her tirades were legendary, volcanic eruptions of fury that could be triggered by the smallest perceived slight. An employee could be fired on the spot for a scuff on a shoe, a hair out of place, or simply for being in her line of sight on a bad day. The atmosphere in her hotels was one of palpable terror, staff whispering warnings to each other when she was on the premises. A queen whose arrival signaled not honor, but dread. The pettiness of her demands became the stuff of dark legend. There was the infamous office coffee fund, where she insisted employees pay for every single cup they consumed from the communal pot, meticulously tracking the pennies. She was known to personally examine the hotel's trash, searching for evidence of waste, like a partially used bar of soap, which could lead to immediate dismissal for the housekeeper responsible. The contrast between her public and private self was not just a gap, it was a chasm. In one hand, she held the image of the guardian of luxury. In the other, she wielded a relentless, degrading scrutiny that broke the spirit of those who worked for her. This duality raises a difficult question. Was the demanding perfectionist in the ads a clever exaggeration of a tough boss? Or was the cruel dictator behind the scenes the real Leona, with the smiling queen merely a fabricated mask? The truth likely lived in the terrifying space between, where an insatiable need for control and a bottomless well of contempt festered beneath the diamonds and furs. This reputation did more than make her disliked. It created a reservoir of bitterness and fear among those who knew her best, a reservoir that would, in time, overflow and become the very evidence that toppled her reign. Navigating the Queen's court required a specific, almost desperate kind of loyalty. To survive in Leona Helmsley's orbit, you had to master a perilous dance, anticipating her whims, absorbing her fury, and never, ever showing a hint of defiance. This created a claustrophobic inner circle, a handful of aides, accountants, and lawyers who became the essential gears of her personal and professional machine. They were the buffers between her volcanic temper and the daily operations of a billion-dollar empire. Their loyalty was not born of admiration, but of complex cocktail of fear, financial dependence, and in some cases, a twisted sense of shared purpose. They learned the unspoken rules, that her word was law, her mood was the office weather, and their primary job was to make the impossible happen, regardless of cost or ethics. Among these key figures was her longtime personal lawyer, a man deeply enmeshed in the family's financial and legal affairs. Another was the chief financial officer for the Helmsley Enterprises, the keeper of the books who understood where every dollar flowed. Then there were the personal assistants and house managers, the ones who witnessed the most intimate details of her life at Dunellan Hall. These were not distant employees. They were confidants by necessity, privy to conversations and decisions that happened far from the boardroom. They saw the real mechanics of her world, the blurring of lines between corporate expense and personal desire, the casual instructions to make a problem disappear. For years, this system held because the reward for loyalty was immense, job security in a coveted position, generous bonuses, and a front row seat to unimaginable wealth. But the punishment for disloyalty, or even perceived failure, was immediate and absolute: career ruin and banishment from the kingdom. This atmosphere of perpetual anxiety created a pressure cooker, where people held terrible secrets not out of devotion, but out of pure survival instinct. What happens when the walls of that pressure cooker begin to crack? When the fear of the Queen is suddenly outweighed by the fear of a federal prison sentence? The very people who enabled her world, the loyalists who knew too much, would become the architects of its collapse. The pressure of maintaining that gilded world was immense, and by the late 1980s, the foundation beneath it began to shift. The real estate market, the very source of the Helmsley fortune, entered a steep and painful downturn. Property values in New York City slumped, vacancies rose in their commercial buildings, and the river of cash that funded their extravagant lifestyle began to slow to a trickle. For a couple whose identity was so completely tied to visible, limitless wealth, this was not just a financial problem. It was an existential threat. The Queen could not be seen to have a threadbare robe. So, faced with this squeeze, a dangerous and illegal solution was quietly put into practice. The line between the Helmsley business empire and the Helmsley personal life, always blurry, was now deliberately erased. An elaborate system was created where nearly every aspect of their personal spending was funneled through their corporate companies and written off as a legitimate business expense. The scale was breathtaking. That stunning marble dance floor at Dunelin Hall, billed to the hotel business as a capital improvement. Leona's immense personal wardrobe, her furs, her designer dresses, even her silk stockings, charged to the hotels as uniforms or decor. The staggering costs of renovating their Greenwich mansion, from plumbing to landscaping, were meticulously coded and deducted. Jewelry purchases worth hundreds of thousands of dollars appeared on corporate ledgers. It was a massive, ongoing fiction, a deliberate effort to make the United States Treasury subsidize a private kingdom. The logic was chillingly simple. If you control the empire, you make the rules and you decide what the empire pays for. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a calculated, long-term strategy to preserve a lifestyle at any cost, a belief that their private world was above the mundane laws of accounting and tax. But every invoice, every falsified ledger entry, was a brick in a wall that would eventually imprison them. The scheme required the complicity of that inner circle, the lawyers and bookkeepers who now faced a terrible choice: follow the Queen's orders into illegality, or break the circle of loyalty and face her wrath. Every castle has its disgruntled artisans, and Dunelin Hall was no exception. Among the many contractors who passed through its gilded gates was a woman named Liz Benedetto. She was a decorator, hired to work on the lavish interiors of the Helmsley mansion, a dream job that quickly turned into a financial nightmare. For months, she submitted her invoices for work completed, only to have them ignored, disputed, or paid in frustratingly slow drips. This was a common tactic, using their immense power to squeeze small businesses, to make them wait for money that was rightfully theirs. But Liz Benedetto was not someone who would simply accept this treatment. She had done the work, she was owed a significant sum, and the Queen's refusal to pay was not just an inconvenience, it was a personal insult. Furious and feeling cheated, she began to look for leverage. And then she remembered the boxes. During her time at the mansion, she had seen how things operated. She knew that invoices for personal extravagances, from chandeliers to fabric for Leona's closets, were being systematically coded to the business. In a moment of defiant clarity, she took a bold and dangerous step. She gathered a trove of these incriminating documents, a paper trail of the very scheme we just discussed, packed them into a box, and walked them directly to the offices of the New York Post. This was not a tip to a financial regulator or a quiet letter to the IRS. This was revenge served hot in public to the most sensational newspaper in the city. She handed over the evidence to the editors, knowing full well the media firestorm it would ignite. The headline practically wrote itself, and soon, the story of the Helmsleys' creative accounting was splashed across the front page for all of New York to see. That single box of invoices, delivered out of pure spite, was the spark. It transformed a private contractor's dispute into a very public scandal, and it gave federal investigators the perfect, undeniable reason to knock on the palace door. The Queen's walls, built on fear and secrecy, had been breached not by a rival tycoon, but by a fed-up decorator with a stack of unpaid bills. The box of invoices delivered to the tabloids was a starting pistol. It launched a federal investigation that moved with the quiet, relentless precision of a machine. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, working in tandem with the Internal Revenue Service, now had a clear target and a mountain of potential evidence to sift through. This was no longer about a newspaper headline. It was about building a criminal case that could withstand the formidable legal defenses of a billion-dollar empire. Their first move was to issue a sweeping wave of subpoenas, legal demands for documents that could not be ignored. They descended on the Helmsley organization, requesting years of financial records, ledger books, canceled checks, and internal memos from dozens of their corporate entities. The goal was to follow the money, to trace a single damning line from a personal luxury directly to a fraudulent business deduction. Imagine an accountant's nightmare, piecing together receipts for silk drapes at Dunellan Hall and finding them listed as hotel curtain replacements, or seeing a $200,000 diamond ring purchase coded as a security equipment expense for a corporate building. The prosecutors were not just looking for mistakes. They were mapping a conspiracy, a deliberate and agreed-upon plan to defraud the government. This meant they needed to prove that Leona and Harry Helmsley, along with their top aides, knowingly and willfully participated in this scheme. The paper trail was crucial, but paper does not talk. To bring the story behind the numbers to life, they needed witnesses, the very people who had executed the Queen's orders. This is where the investigation applied its most intense pressure. One by one, members of that terrified inner circle were brought in for questioning. They were faced with a stark choice: cooperate with the government and potentially avoid prison, or remain loyal to Leona and face the full weight of federal charges alongside her. The prosecution's strategy was classic and effective: flip the insiders. They focused on the chief financial officer, the bookkeepers, the personal secretaries who had processed the invoices. They showed them the evidence, explained the prison sentences for tax fraud and conspiracy, and offered them a path out, immunity or reduced charges in exchange for their truthful testimony. For these employees, years of living in fear of Leona's temper now collided with a new, more profound fear: the loss of their own freedom. The pressure was immense and utterly isolating. The wall of loyalty that had protected the Helmsleys for so long began to crumble as individuals, facing ruin, started to talk. They provided the context the ledgers could not. The meetings where Leona explicitly directed them to bill personal items to the company. The hushed conversations about keeping the auditors in the dark. The culture of fear that ensured compliance. The prosecution was no longer just building a case about money. They were building a case about power, control, and a shared understanding that the rules simply did not apply to them. The Queen's Court was turning into the state's witness list. The legal machinery finally completed its work in the summer of 1988. On a morning that would become one of the most photographed in New York history, a federal grand jury handed down a sweeping indictment. Leona and Harry Helmsley, along with two of their top corporate lawyers, were formally charged with conspiracy to defraud the United States, tax evasion, and mail fraud. The numbers were staggering. Prosecutors alleged they had schemed to evade over $1.2 million in federal income taxes by fraudulently billing more than $4 million in personal expenses to their various business companies. The indictment was not a dry financial document. It was a catalog of breathtaking excess disguised as business necessity. Item by item, it laid bare the private indulgences taxpayers had allegedly subsidized. There was the $210,000 stereo system for Dunelin Hall, billed as a sound system for a hotel health club. The $130,000 mahogany dance floor, the very one built for a single party, was listed as a corporate capital improvement. Even a $100,000 silver clock for their mansion's entry hall was fraudulently expensed. Each line item was a dagger aimed at their public image, transforming the queen of luxury into a defendant accused of theft. The perp walk that followed was a media spectacle of epic proportions. Surrounded by federal agents, Leona Helmsley was led from a government building in Manhattan, her hands cuffed in front of her. The cameras exploded, flashes popping like a relentless strobe light, reporters shouting questions over each other in a deafening roar. She wore a dark, tailored suit, her hair perfectly coiffed, her face a mask of icy defiance. There was no trace of the smiling hotelier from the commercials, only a hardened, glaring woman who seemed to look straight through the chaos as if it were beneath her. She did not hang her head, she held it high, her jaw set, projecting not remorse but outrage. Harry, frail and elderly, walked beside her, his expression one of profound confusion and shock, a stark contrast to his wife's steely composure. This image, the billionaire queen in handcuffs, would dominate newspapers and television broadcasts for days. It was the perfect, brutal collision of two worlds, the gilded fantasy she had sold to the public smashing against the cold metal reality of the law. The headlines were merciless: Queen of Mean indicted, palace coup, Helmsley's charged in tax scheme. For the public, it was a moment of visceral, dramatic justice, a tycoon brought low. For Leona, it was the ultimate humiliation, a forced march from her palace to the steps of a courthouse. Yet even in handcuffs, she refused to play the part of a defeated monarch. Her demeanor sent a clear message. She was not sorry, she was not afraid, and she was certainly not guilty. This defiance would define her strategy for the brutal legal battle to come, a battle where the evidence was not just on paper, but in the memories of the people who had once been her most loyal servants. The courtroom became a theater, and every day was a sold-out performance. As the trial opened in the summer of 1989, the federal courthouse in Manhattan took on a carnival atmosphere. Reporters and camera crews swarmed the sidewalks. Spectators lined up for a chance at a public seat, and the air buzzed with the anticipation of a public reckoning. Inside, the drama was more subdued but far more damning. The prosecution's case was built on two unshakable pillars: a mountain of paper and the voices of those who had been too afraid to speak. They presented the jury with invoice after invoice, each one a tiny piece of a massive fraudulent mosaic. A receipt for a $46,000 jade necklace was entered into evidence, billed as a hotel decor item. An invoice for a $100,000 silver clock for the Greenwich Mansion was shown, coded to a corporate maintenance account. The paper trail was relentless, a numbing recitation of luxury disguised as business. But paper is cold. It was the human testimony that gave the numbers a soul and a sting. One by one, former members of Leona Helmsley's inner circle took the stand, their faces pale with nervousness. They were the bookkeepers, the secretaries, the managers who had processed those very invoices. They testified about the explicit instructions, the culture of fear, the understanding that personal spending was simply to be funneled through the corporate maze. Yet of all the witnesses, it was the testimony of a former housekeeper, a woman named Elizabeth Baum, that would etch itself permanently into the public memory. She described a casual conversation at Dunelin Hall, a moment of stunning candor amid the opulence. According to her sworn testimony, Leona had waved off a discussion about taxes with a dismissive, contemptuous remark. "Oh, we don't pay taxes," she allegedly said. "Only the little people pay taxes." The impact in the courtroom was electric. You could almost hear the collective gasp, followed by the furious scratching of every reporter's notepad. That single sentence, just 10 words long, became the trial's defining soundbite. It was no longer just about falsified invoices or evaded payments. It was about a philosophy, a world you laid bare. It crystallized the entire case into a perfect, damning idea that Leona Helmsley saw herself as existing on a different plane, exempt from the burdens of ordinary citizens. The prosecution seized on it, not just as evidence of arrogance, but as a window into the intent behind the crime. It showed a conscious belief that the rules were for others, for the little people, a mindset that made tax fraud not a complicated scheme, but a simple entitlement. For the public watching at home, it was the ultimate confirmation of the Queen of Mean persona. A ruler so detached from reality, she viewed the fundamental duty of citizenship as beneath her. That quote would haunt her for the rest of her life, transforming her from a wealthy defendant into a symbol of unbridled greed and contempt. In the jury's ears, it echoed long after the witness left the stand, a stark reminder of the human arrogance behind the cold financial facts. Faced with that mountain of evidence and the damning testimony, Leona Helmsley's defense team had a monumental task. Their strategy was not to deny the invoices existed, but to reframe the entire story, shifting both blame and motive onto someone else. They argued that Harry Helmsley, the quiet real estate genius, was the sole architect of the entire tax scheme. Leona, they claimed, was merely his loyal and obedient wife, a woman so dedicated to her husband's business that she blindly followed his instructions without questioning their legality. This was a calculated play on deeply ingrained gender stereotypes of the time, painting Harry as the powerful puppet master and Leona as the submissive, if demanding, puppet. They portrayed her infamous attention to detail not as evidence of her controlling nature, but as proof She was simply a hardworking executive carrying out her husband's vision, too busy with linens and silverware to understand complex corporate accounting. To bolster this narrative, they launched a fierce campaign to discredit the prosecution's key witnesses. They painted the former employees who testified as disgruntled liars, motivated by revenge after being fired or denied raises. They attacked their character, their memories, and their motives, suggesting they were concocting stories to win favor with the government or to settle personal scores. The defense worked tirelessly to soften Leona's public image for the jury, showing home videos of her doting on her dogs and portraying her as a devoted partner to an ailing Harry, whose mental faculties, they suggested, were in decline. They wanted the jury to see a misunderstood businesswoman, a scapegoat for a man who could no longer defend himself. But this strategy contained fatal flaws. The jury had heard the witnesses describe Leona's fiery, domineering personality firsthand. They had seen her icy defiance during the perp walk. The idea that this formidable woman was a passive follower simply did not ring true. Her very public persona as the queen who stood guard contradicted the defense's portrait of a submissive wife. Furthermore, the paper trail often led directly to her, with her personal secretary testifying about Leona's specific instructions on how to code expenses. The little people, quote, hung in the air, a sentiment of breathtaking arrogance that no amount of home videos could erase. In the end, the defense's attempt to assassinate the character of the witnesses and recast Leona's role failed because it asked the jury to ignore the overwhelming evidence of her command. They could not reconcile the queen of the Helmsley Empire with the idea of a pawn. The narrative of blind obedience collapsed under the weight of her very visible, very assertive reign. The jury took only 12 hours to reach its decision. In a packed courtroom on a tense morning in August 1989, the foreperson stood and delivered the verdicts, one after another, in a clear, steady voice. Leona Helmsley was found guilty on 33 federal counts, including tax evasion, conspiracy to defraud, and mail fraud. The sheer number of convictions was staggering, a complete and total repudiation of her defense. Meanwhile, her husband Harry was spared the same fate, but not out of innocence. In a separate ruling weeks earlier, a judge had declared him mentally unfit to stand trial, his mind eroded by age and illness. The legal strategy to portray him as the mastermind had succeeded only in saving him from the dock, while leaving Leona to bear the full, crushing weight of justice alone. As the verdicts were read, her famous composure finally fractured. She did not cry out, but her face, that mask of defiance, drained of color. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, as if the floor had just fallen away beneath her. The queen had been judged by a jury of her peers, and they had found her guilty on all counts. She was now a convicted felon, staring down the possibility of decades in a federal prison, a sentence that could mean life for a woman of her age. Outside the courthouse, the public reaction split along predictable lines. For many, it was a moment of pure vindication. The Queen of Mean had gotten exactly what she deserved, a spectacular fall for a woman who believed she was above the law. Tabloids celebrated with gleeful headlines, yet in some circles of New York's business elite, a quieter, more complicated sentiment emerged. There was a murmur that she was a victim of a witch hunt, that her real crime was being a tough, successful woman in a man's world, and that the government had made an example of her because of her flamboyant, unapologetic wealth. This division reflected the two Americas that had watched her trial, one that saw justice and another that saw envy dressed in a prosecutor's suit. But legal reality cares little for public opinion. The gavel had fallen. The fantasy was over. All that remained was for the judge to decide the price she would pay for building her palace on a foundation of fraud. The moment of final judgment arrived in a courtroom thick with anticipation. This was not about guilt and amour that had been decided. The sentencing hearing was about punishment, about measuring the cost of her crimes in years of freedom. The prosecution did not hold back. They argued passionately for a severe sentence, pointing not just to the millions in evaded taxes, but to Leona Helmsley's complete and utter lack of remorse. She had never apologized, never admitted wrongdoing. Throughout the trial and after the verdict, she maintained her icy defiance, a stance the government claimed proved she saw herself as a victim, not a criminal. They painted her as unrepentant, a woman whose arrogance was as vast as her wealth, and they asked the judge to send a clear message that no one, not even a hotel queen, was above the law. Then it was the judge's turn. Federal Judge John Walker did not mince words. He looked directly at Leona Helmsley and delivered a verbal indictment far more personal than the legal charges. He condemned her naked greed, a phrase that would become forever attached to her legacy. He spoke of her contempt for the system, her betrayal of the public trust, and the corrosive example she set. This was the symbolic dethronement, a judicial pronouncement that stripped away her royal pretenses and revealed the crime at their core. Then he delivered the sentence. Leona Helmsley was ordered to serve 4 years in a federal prison. She was fined $7.1 million and ordered to perform 750 hours of community service. The prison term was less than the maximum, but for a woman in her 70s accustomed to absolute control, it was a life-altering catastrophe. The clang of the judge's gavel was the sound of her reign ending. The queen was no longer guarding a palace. She was a convicted felon being processed into the Bureau of Prisons, her future now dictated by guards and schedules. The empire would have to run without its sovereign, and the world watched, wondering if prison walls could finally humble a woman who believed she answered to no one. The transition from a penthouse to a prison cell is not merely a change of address. For Leona Helmsley, now known as federal inmate number 15113-054, it was a violent stripping away of her entire identity. She was assigned to the federal prison camp in Lexington, Kentucky, a minimum security facility often called a camp for its lack of walls, but a prison nonetheless. The legendary wardrobe of designer suits and furs was replaced by a standard-issue khaki uniform. The private elevators and chauffeured Rolls-Royces gave way to walking in lines and head counts. Her palace of 28 rooms was exchanged for a small, shared cubicle in an open dormitory, a space offering zero privacy and constant noise. The queen, who demanded absolute silence from her staff, now had to sleep surrounded by the sounds of strangers. The daily routine was a study in deliberate mundanity, a form of punishment in its own right. She was assigned a job like every other inmate, tasked with cleaning the prison's communal bathrooms. Imagine the woman who once inspected marble floors for microscopic dust, now on her knees scraping toilets. The psychological whiplash must have been profound. Every aspect of her life was now regulated, from when she could use the telephone to what she could purchase at the commissary. The control she wielded like a weapon was gone, replaced by a system where she had no authority whatsoever. Yet old habits die hard. Even in this environment, stories emerged of Leona attempting to assert a ghost of her former command. She was reportedly appalled by the quality of the prison food and is said to have complained bitterly to other inmates about the poor service. She tried to organize the cleaning supplies in her own specific way, clashing with both inmates and guards over procedure. These were tiny, futile rebellions, attempts to carve out a sliver of the control that defined her. They were not seen as leadership, but as the irritating quirks of a difficult prisoner, further isolating her from the community around her. The other inmates, many from backgrounds worlds apart from hers, had little patience for the woman famous for saying only the little people paid taxes. She was an outsider, a living curiosity, but not a friend. This isolation, more than the uniform or the chores, may have been the true punishment. For the first time in decades, Leona Helmsley was in a place where her money meant nothing. Her name commanded no fear, and her reputation only bred resentment. The experience was a brutal, forced humility. The woman who spent millions on a dance floor now calculated the value of a bag of chips from the prison store. The sovereign who held court in gilded lobbies now ate at a long table in a noisy cafeteria, utterly alone. Prison did not break her defiant spirit entirely, but it certainly bent it, forcing a confrontation with a reality she had spent a lifetime insulating herself from. In that sterile, regimented environment, stripped of every external symbol of her power, who was Leona Helmsley, really? The answer to that question was still being written, not in ledgers or headlines, but in the quiet, lonely rhythm of life as inmate 054. Prison walls could not stop the passage of time outside. In January 1997, while Leona was serving her sentence in Kentucky, Harry Helmsley passed away in a New York hospital. He was 87 years old, and his health had been failing for years, a decline that had spared him a prison sentence, but not a lonely end. Leona, the fiercely devoted wife, was not by his side. She was granted a brief, heavily guarded furlough to attend his funeral, a surreal and somber return to the world she had lost. Dressed in black, surrounded by federal marshals, she mourned the man who had been both her partner and her passport to a kingdom. His death was more than a personal tragedy. It was a seismic financial shift. Harry's will left her with a vast fortune, but it also triggered a labyrinthine legal battle with his estate's other beneficiaries, a war over the empire's remains that would drag on for years. She was now the sole embattled monarch of a realm in chaos, and she was still, for the moment, a prisoner. Later that same year, after serving just 18 months of her 4-year sentence, Leona Helmsley was released on parole. She emerged into a New York that had moved on without her. The terms of her release were strict. She was required to perform those 750 hours of community service, a mandate she reportedly fulfilled by working with programs for blind children, though always under a cloud of public skepticism about her motives. More confining than any legal condition was the profound change in her circumstances. She returned to her penthouse at the Helmsley Palace, but it was no longer a command center buzzing with power. It felt more like a gilded cage. The hotel empire was still there, but the magic was gone. The queen persona was now a punchline, a symbol of greed rather than luxury. The staff, once terrified of her, now saw a diminished, elderly woman shadowed by scandal. She tried to step back into her former life, attempting to reassert control over the business, but the world refused to bow. The media followed her every move, portraying her community service as a cynical ploy. Old business associates were wary, and the public's fascination had curdled into enduring contempt. She had the money, the properties, the jewels, but the authority and respect she craved were irrevocably ashes. The throne still existed, but no one was listening to the queen. Her kingdom had become a quiet, lonely fortress, and her remaining battles would be fought not in hotel lobbies, but in the cold, private arena of family strife and endless litigation. Her final act would be her most ambitious and her most bitterly contested. After prison, Leona Helmsley possessed a fortune, but not a legacy. The name Helmsley was synonymous with scandal, not service. To change that, she turned to the classic playbook of the disgraced wealthy, philanthropy, but on a scale that could not be ignored. In 2007, she announced a staggering $25 million donation to New York Presbyterian Hospital. The gift was earmarked for a new state-of-the-art emergency room and trauma center, a facility that would bear her name, for a public that remembered her as the woman who scorned the little people. This was a stunning reversal. The hospital heralded her generosity, and the press covered the announcement with a mix of awe and deep skepticism. Was this the genuine remorse of a woman reflecting on her crimes, a late-in-life attempt to do some tangible good with her wealth? Or was it a calculated, expensive bid to scrub her public image clean, to ensure the name Leona Helmsley would be etched in marble for saving lives, not for cheating taxes? The evidence supported both views. Those who believed in her contrition pointed to the sheer size of the gift and its focus on a public, life-saving cause. Critics, however, noted the timing and the optics. The donation came as she was engaged in a brutal legal war over her husband's estate, a fight where public sympathy could be a powerful weapon. Furthermore, the act felt transactional, less about quiet charity and more about erecting a permanent monument to a revised version of herself. This philanthropic push was part of a larger, exhausting campaign to reclaim control. Harry Helmsley's will had not left her everything outright. Instead, it placed much of the empire in a trust, with executors and other beneficiaries holding power. Leona spent years in court, suing the trustees, alleging mismanagement, and fighting for what she saw as her rightful dominion over the Helmsley kingdom. These were not quiet legal proceedings. They were vicious, public battles that revealed the deep fractures within the family and the business. She argued the trustees were squandering Harry's legacy, while they countered that she was an unstable and vindictive force trying to loot the estate. Each courtroom appearance dragged the old scandals back into the light, undermining any progress her philanthropy might have made. The two efforts, the generous donor and the relentless litigant, existed in stark, confusing parallel. One hand offered millions to heal the sick. The other was clenched in a fist, fighting for every last dollar and shred of authority. This duality defined her twilight years. She lived in her penthouse, overseeing a diminished but still vast empire, surrounded by lawyers and lawsuits instead of adoring guests. The queen was back in her tower, but she was ruling over a realm of paperwork and bitterness, her every move scrutinized and contested. The grand donation to the hospital stands as a physical testament to her wealth and her desire to be remembered differently. Yet it is forever shadowed by the question of motive, a final, expensive layer of polish on a legacy that remained, at its core, deeply tarnished. Yet the final, shocking twist in Leona Helmsley's story arrived after her death. In 2007, she passed away at the age of 87, leaving behind a fortune estimated to be worth billions. The world waited to see how the hotel queen would distribute her legendary wealth, expecting perhaps a complex web of trusts and charitable foundations. What was revealed instead was a document that seemed to confirm every dark public suspicion about her character. Her last will and testament was a masterpiece of posthumous spite. The bulk of her personal estate, a staggering $12 million, was left in a trust for the care of her beloved Maltese dog, a tiny white fluff ball named Trouble. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a fully funded, legally binding endowment to ensure the dog would live out its days in the lap of unimaginable luxury, with a full-time security detail and a menu of gourmet food. Meanwhile, in a cold and deliberate snub, 2 of her 4 grandchildren were cut out of the will entirely, receiving not a single cent. The other 2 grandchildren were left bequests, but with a cruel and unusual condition. They would only receive their money if they visited their father's grave at least once a year, a demand that turned familial remembrance into a monitored transaction. The public reaction was a perfect storm of disbelief and outrage. Headlines screamed around the world, "Billionaire leaves fortune to dog." For the average person struggling with bills, the image of a dog inheriting $12 million was not just eccentric, it was morally grotesque. It felt like the ultimate extension of her little people philosophy, a belief that even her pet was more deserving than her own flesh and blood. The act was seen not as quirky affection for an animal, but as a final, calculated insult to the very concept of family. It cemented her legacy not as a tough businesswoman, but as a uniquely cruel and emotionally barren figure. Of course, the disinherited grandchildren did not accept this quietly. They launched a fierce legal challenge, arguing that Leona was not of sound mind when she signed the will, unduly influenced by advisors who stood to gain from managing the dog's massive trust fund. The ensuing court battle was a surreal spectacle, with lawyers debating the reasonable annual budget for a canine's security and grooming. In the end, a judge agreed the bequest was excessive. Trouble's inheritance was reduced to a mere $2 million, a sum the judge deemed sufficient for the dog's lifetime care. The grandchildren eventually received a settlement, but the damage to the family name was permanent. This bizarre bequest became the defining capstone of her life's narrative. It overshadowed her business achievements, her philanthropy, and even her prison sentence. In the public imagination, Leona Helmsley would forever be the woman who loved her dog more than her own grandchildren, the queen who, even in death, could not stop ruling with a heart of stone. The woman who once commanded an empire now commanded only a small suite of rooms. In her final years, Leona Helmsley's world shrank dramatically, confined largely to a penthouse apartment at the Helmsley Park Lane Hotel. The grand tours of her properties, the explosive tirades, the very public battles, all faded into a quiet, isolated existence. Her formidable health began to fail her, a cruel irony for someone who valued control above all else. She suffered from congestive heart failure, a condition that left her weak and increasingly dependent on round-the-clock nursing care. Perhaps more devastating was the onset of dementia, a fog that slowly clouded the sharp, calculating mind that had built and defended her kingdom. The queen, who never forgot a detail, was now losing track of days, conversations, and even the faces of those around her. Her primary companion was not a family member or an old friend from her glory days, but her beloved Maltese dog, Trouble, the same animal that would later inherit her fortune. The tiny dog was a constant presence, a living link to a simpler affection in a life otherwise defined by conflict. A small, loyal staff attended to her, but they were employees, guardians of a fading legend, not confidantes. The isolation was both physical and profound. She was a prisoner of her own making, surrounded by the opulent trappings of her success, but utterly disconnected from the vibrant, punishing world she once ruled. The phone calls from lawyers still came. The lawsuits over Harry's estate dragged on in her name, but these were echoes of past wars, managed by advisors while she remained in her secluded eyrie, looking out over a Manhattan skyline that had long since moved on without her. Her death, when it came in August 2007, felt almost like an afterthought to a public that had watched her dramatic fall decades earlier. She was 87 years old. The official cause was heart failure, but in many ways, she had been receding from the world for years. There was no grand public mourning, no state funeral for a hotelier. The news was met with a complex, muted response, a mixture of lingering scorn, pity, and a reluctant acknowledgement of her sheer force of will. Her legacy, in that moment, was irrevocably split. On one side stood the undeniable business achievements, the iconic hotels, the marketing genius that redefined luxury hospitality. On the other stood the indelible image of the Queen of Mean, the convicted felon, the woman who believed taxes were for the little people and who left millions to her dog. These two halves refused to reconcile. She was both a self-made titan and a cautionary tale, a builder of palaces and a breaker of spirits. Which version endures? Perhaps the truest answer is that they are inseparable, forever entwined in the story of a Brooklyn striver who reached the pinnacle of wealth and power, only to discover that the throne she built was made of the most fragile glass. Her shadow stretched far beyond the courtroom and the business pages, seeping into the very fabric of American culture. Leona Helmsley did not just become a famous convict, she became a cultural archetype, a living symbol for an era defined by excess. Throughout the late 1980s and 90s, her name was a punchline delivered with glee by late-night television hosts. Comedians built entire routines around her little people quote, using it as the ultimate shorthand for out-of-touch elitism. She was the villain in 1,000 cocktail party conversations, the real-world caricature of everything the public feared about unbridled wealth and power. Her story provided a satisfying narrative arc that felt almost fictional. The arrogant queen brought low by her own greed, a modern-day morality play played out on the front page of every tabloid. This resonance was so powerful, it began to inspire fiction itself. While not a direct copy, the essence of Leona Helmsley, the terrifying, perfection-obsessed female tyrant who rules her domain through fear, is widely seen as a key inspiration for characters like Miranda Priestley in The Devil Wears Prada. The dynamic is unmistakable. The demanding boss who treats employees as disposable, the icy demeanor masking a relentless drive, the luxurious world that serves as both kingdom and prison. Leona was the proof that such a character could exist in reality, making the fictional version all the more potent and believable. Her legacy became a cautionary tale in 3 distinct parts. First, she embodied the speculative greed of the 1980s, a time when the pursuit of wealth was seen as a virtue in itself, often divorced from ethics. Second, her fall illustrated the ancient, timeless peril of hubris, the dangerous belief that one is immune to the rules that govern everyone else. And finally, her story challenged and ultimately dismantled the corrosive myth that extreme wealth places a person above the law. The image of her in handcuffs was a powerful corrective, a visceral reminder that the legal system, however imperfect, could still reach the highest towers. Yet, even as she served as a warning, a part of the public remained fascinated, even perversely admiring of her sheer audacity. This duality is why she endures. We condemn her actions, but we cannot look away from the spectacle of her life, a stark and glittering monument to the price of building a throne on a foundation of contempt. Her case was more than a personal downfall. It was a legal earthquake that reshaped the playing field for white-collar crime. The prosecutors did not just charge Leona Helmsley with tax fraud. They invoked a powerful and controversial weapon, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO. This law was originally crafted in 1970 to dismantle the mafia, targeting the leadership of criminal enterprises like the Gambino or Genovese crime families. Its purpose was to connect the bosses to the crimes of their underlings, proving they ran a corrupt organization. Using RICO against a hotel queen and her corporate executives was a stunning, aggressive move. It sent a clear message that the Helmsley empire, with its systematic fraud and culture of fear, was being viewed not just as a business that broke some rules, but as a corrupt organization in its own right, a corporate racket. This legal strategy allowed prosecutors to tie together the many separate acts of fraud into a single, overarching pattern of criminal activity. It painted a picture of a conspiracy that was ongoing, organized, and central to the operation of the business itself. The implications were profound. A RICO conviction carries severe penalties, including longer prison sentences and the forfeiture of assets gained through the criminal enterprise. By deploying it, the government was declaring that white-collar crime on a grand scale would no longer be treated as a complex accounting error or a civil dispute, but as a serious criminal conspiracy akin to organized crime. This case became a landmark precedent, a proof of concept that RICO could be a viable tool against powerful corporate figures who used their legitimate businesses as fronts for fraud. It signaled a new era of prosecutorial aggressiveness, showing that the Justice Department was willing to use its most formidable legal tools to reach into the boardrooms and penthouse suites of the elite. In the years that followed, This template would be studied and adapted, influencing how authorities approached other complex financial crimes. The Queen's case demonstrated that when the facade of respectability cracks, revealing a pattern of corruption beneath, the law now had a vocabulary and a framework to treat it not as a lapse, but as a racket. The courtroom doors may have closed, but the debate over her true role never ended. Did Harry Helmsley, the quiet titan, truly bear the greater burden of guilt? The defense painted him as the sole architect, a narrative supported by his mental decline and the fact that the fraud began long before Leona became the public face of the empire. Yet this theory falters under the weight of her documented behavior. Witnesses described her not as a passive follower, but as an active, often terrifying enforcer of the system. She personally scrutinized invoices and dictated how they should be coded. Her management style was one of absolute control, making it difficult to believe she was merely executing a plan she knew nothing about. The most likely truth is a murky partnership, where Harry's established corporate structures provided the vehicle, and Leona's relentless drive and personal spending provided the fuel, with both choosing to look away from the legal line they were crossing. Then there is the infamous quote that defined her public persona forever. Leona Helmsley always vehemently denied ever saying, "We don't pay taxes. Only the little people pay taxes." She insisted the housekeeper fabricated it. So did 10 words from a single witness truly sway an entire jury? In a trial filled with thousands of documents, it seems improbable that one sentence alone could convict her. But its power was not as direct evidence of tax fraud. It was as a window into intent. For the jury, that quote crystallized the mindset behind the crime. It transformed a complex financial scheme into a simple, arrogant philosophy, making the dry numbers feel like a personal betrayal. Whether she said it or not became almost irrelevant, because by the time it was uttered in court, it perfectly explained everything the public already believed about the Queen of Mean. It gave the crime a motive everyone could understand: contempt. The mysteries only deepen when we look at her final, most personal act, the will. Why would a woman who valued legacy above all deliberately disinherit 2 of her 4 grandchildren? The official court battles cited estrangement and disagreements, but the sheer cruelty of the gesture suggests something more. Some theorists believe it was ultimate control from beyond the grave, a final punishment for perceived disloyalty. Others see it as a reflection of her profound isolation, where her dog represented unconditional loyalty she felt was absent from her family. Perhaps it was simply the last grand performance of a woman who had spent a lifetime defining herself by what she could deny others. The fate of the Helmsley fortune after her death became its own sprawling legal drama. The $12 million trust for her dog, Trouble, was successfully challenged by the disinherited grandchildren as excessive and irrational. A judge slashed it to $2 million, a sum still vast enough to fund the dog's security, grooming, and gourmet meals for life. The remaining billions, after settlements with the family, flowed primarily into the Leona M. and Harry B. Helmsley Charitable Trust. In a final, ironic twist, the wealth built by a woman convicted of cheating the system is now one of the largest philanthropic organizations in the world, funding medical research, health care access, and conservation. The Queen's gold, tarnished by scandal, is now being spent to save lives and preserve land, a redemption she herself never sought, but that her money, in the end, would help to buy. Leona Helmsley's life traced an arc of almost mythical scale, a classic American trajectory pushed to its most extreme and cautionary limits. It began with a girl from Brooklyn who believed in hard work and hustle, the very engine of the American dream. She climbed with relentless force from a modest apartment to the pinnacle of New York's gilded society, building an empire of hotels that promised a fantasy of perfection. She crowned herself its queen, and for a time, the world accepted the title. Yet that dream became twisted, curdled by a greed so profound it blinded her to the line between ambition and criminality. Her story is not just one of rise and fall, but of creation and spectacular destruction. She meticulously built a personal brand of uncompromising luxury, only to watch it be dismantled, piece by piece, in a federal courtroom. The persona she sold to the public, the guardian of a palace, was shattered by the reality of the woman who ruled through fear and believed the rules were for other people. And in that shattering lies the timeless democratic lesson that her entire life came to underscore: that no one, no matter how wealthy, how powerful, or how convinced of their own exceptionalism, is truly above the law. The handcuffs that clicked shut around her wrists were a great equalizer, a blunt reminder that the palace walls were an illusion. Her legacy now sits in a strange, dual space. We remember her as a builder of iconic landmarks and as the subject of a prison mugshot. We recall the marketing genius and the infamous quote about little people paying taxes. She is both a self-made success story and the definitive portrait of hubris. This duality forces us to ask a difficult question about how we remember figures of extreme wealth and scandal. Do we focus on their achievements or on their moral failures? Are they titans to be admired or cautionary tales to be studied? Perhaps they are always both, their lives serving as complex mirrors for our own attitudes about ambition, money, and justice. What do you think? In our own modern Gilded Age, with its own larger-than-life heiresses and tycoons, what lessons from Leona Helmsley's reign still feel urgent today? Share your thoughts in the comments below.